In a small village, far from the bustling cities, lived a young girl named Nzube. She was only 2 years old when her life changed forever. Nzube's parents, who loved her dearly, died in a terrible accident. No one could have predicted such a tragedy. The village was quiet and peaceful, and accidents like this were rare. But one day, while her parents were returning from a trip, their car slipped off the narrow, rocky road, and both of them lost their lives. Little Nzube was left alone in the world. The villagers were heartbroken for the little girl. She was too young to understand what had happened. Her bright eyes would still look for her parents, expecting them to return and hold her in their arms. But they never did. She didn't know that they were gone forever. It was a sad time, and everyone in the village felt sorry for her. Among the villagers was an old woman, Nzube's grandmother. She was already old and tired, her hair grey and her back bent for years of hard work. But when she saw that her granddaughter had no one left in the village, she knew what she had to do. Even though she was poor and had very little, she decided to take care of Nzube. This grandmother, though fragile, had a strong spirit. She was determined to give Nzube a good life, no matter how hard it would be. Nzube's grandmother had no wealth. She lived in a small house with only a few old belongings. She didn't have any steady job, but she managed to make a little money by doing odd jobs for the other villagers. Sometimes she would fetch water from the river for people who needed it. The river was far from the village, and carrying heavy pots of water was hard work, especially for someone her age. But she did it anyway. Other times, she would wash clothes for her neighbors, scrubbing them by hand in the cold river water just to earn a few coins. Despite the hard work and the little money she made, Nzube's grandmother never complained. She always put Nzube first. If there was only enough food for one person, she would give it to Nzube. The grandmother often went to bed hungry, her stomach growling, but she didn't care. All that mattered to her was that her granddaughter was fed and happy. She would smile at Nzube as she ate, pretending that she wasn't hungry herself. It was a tough life, but the love she had for Nzube made it all worth it. As Nzube grew older, she started to notice the sacrifices her grandmother was making for her. She saw how hard her grandmother worked, even when she was tired and her body ached. But no matter how difficult things were, her grandmother never let Nzube feel the full weight of their poverty. She made sure Nzube was happy, clothed and fed, and most importantly, she made sure Nzube felt loved. The villagers often praised the grandmother for her kindness and strength. They knew how hard life was for her, and they admired how she never gave up. Some would help her when they could, offering small gifts of food or clothing for Nzube, but it was never enough to make their lives comfortable. They lived day by day, always struggling but always managing to survive. Despite their hardship, Nzube had a happy childhood. She loved her grandmother deeply and was grateful for everything she did. They spent their days together walking through the village, tending to their little garden and fetching water from the river. The grandmother would tell Nzube stories from her own childhood, stories of the village when she was young, and many things she had seen in her long life. These stories fascinated Nzube and helped her forget, even if only for a moment, about the hard life they were living. On days when money was especially tight, there wasn't enough money for both of them. On those days, Grandma would pretend she wasn't hungry, pushing her share of food towards Nzube. "Eat, my dear," she would say with a smile. "I am not hungry today." Nzube, young and trusting, believed her grandmother's words and would eat the food, but the truth was the grandmother's stomach was empty and hunger gnawed at her. Still, she never let Nzube know. The thought of her granddaughter going hungry was unbearable to her. As the years passed, the grandmother's health began to decline. Her body, once strong enough to handle the heavy loads and hard labor, was beginning to weaken. Her back was more horned than before, and her steps were slower. She would often find herself out of breath after carrying the water or washing clothes. There were days when she woke up in the morning and felt like she couldn't get out of bed. But each time she would push herself to keep going. Nzube's grandmother didn't want that for her. She had spent her whole life working tirelessly, scraping together whatever she could to survive. And she didn't want Nzube to follow the same path. She knew that Nzube was smart, kind, and capable of so much more. Nzube deserved a chance to make something of herself, to break free from the circle of poverty that had trapped them for so long. But the grandmother also knew that the only way for Nzube to have this chance was to leave the village and go to the city. The city was a place of opportunity where people could find jobs, education, and a better life. It was a far-off place, buzzing with life and full of new possibilities. The grandmother had never been to the city herself, but she had heard stories from others who had gone there. She spoke of tall buildings, schools where children would learn advanced subjects, and businesses where people could earn good money. The idea of Nzube going to the city gave the grandmother hope, but it also filled her with fear. Sending Nzube to the city meant that she would no longer have her granddaughter by her side. It meant that she would be alone, living without the one person who gave life meaning. Finally, the day came for Nzube to leave. The entire village gathered to say goodbye to her, wishing her well on her journey. Nzube's grandmother stood by her side, holding her hand tightly. As the bus pulled up to take Nzube to the city, the grandmother hugged her tightly one last time. "Remember, Nzube," she said softly, "no matter what happens, I will always be here for you. Work hard, stay strong, and make the most of this opportunity. I love you, my dear." With tears in her eyes, Nzube nodded. "I love you too, Grandma. I promise I'll make you proud." And with that, Nzube climbed onto the bus, waving goodbye as he drove away. Her heart was heavy with the thought of leaving her grandmother behind, but she also felt a sense of hope. The city was a place of opportunity and she was ready to face whatever challenges it would bring. As the bus disappeared over the horizon, the grandmother stood alone, watching until it was out of sight. She wiped a tear from her eyes and whispered to herself, "Be safe, my dear Nzube, be safe." With Nzube now gone, the grandmother returned to her quiet, empty house. The house felt lonelier than ever. Nzube's new life in the city began with a mixture of excitement and nervousness. The city was nothing like the quiet village she had grown up in. It was full of people rushing to and fro, tall buildings that seemed to touch the sky, and streets crowded with cars and noise. The pace of life was fast, and Nzube had never seen anything like it before. She felt out of place at first, a village girl lost in the middle of a big, unfamiliar world. But deep inside, she carried the hope her grandmother had given her, the hope of a better future. Nzube stayed with her grandmother's old friend's daughter, who was already studying at the university. Her new home was a small apartment, cramped and shared with several other students, but it was a safe place, and Nzube was grateful. The other students were kind to her and they helped her get used to the life in the city. They showed her how to navigate the busy streets, where to buy food, and how to manage her time with her studies. It was all new to Nzube, but slowly she began to adjust. Despite her declining health, the grandmother never missed sending money to Nzube. She saved every coin she earned, cutting back on her own needs to make sure there was enough to send each month. There were days when she would go without eating just to ensure Nzube had something to eat in the city. She knew how expensive life in the city could be, and the thought of Nzube going hungry was unbearable to her. So, she starved herself, pretending she wasn't hungry, and focused on making sure Nzube had everything she needed. Nzube, unaware of how much her grandmother was sacrificing, continued her life in the city. She was busy with her studies and adjusting to city life. And though she missed her grandmother, the distance between them made it easy to overlook the struggles the old woman was facing back home. Whenever she received money from her grandmother, she felt grateful but never truly understood the cost her grandmother was paying to support her. Then one day, something happened that changed everything. Nzube was in her hostel cooking a simple meal for herself after a long day of studying. She was frying some food when she accidentally spilled hot oil from the pan. The oil splashed onto her face, burning her skin and worst of all, pouring into her eyes. The pain was unbearable that she screamed out. Her roommate rushed to her aid, helping her to get to the hospital. When they arrived, the doctors immediately began treating the burns, but they were concerned about her eyes. The oil has caused severe damage, and there was a real risk that she might lose her vision in that eye. Nzube was terrified. The thought of going blind was overwhelming, and she didn't know what to do. All she could think was her grandmother and how she had worked so hard to give her this opportunity. How could she face her grandmother if she couldn't finish her studies? As the doctors continued to treat her, one of Nzube's friends called her grandmother in the village to tell her what had happened. Immediately Grandma heard the news, she felt devastated and rushed to the city. When grandmother arrived at the hospital, she could barely contain her emotions. She rushed to Nzube's side, tears streaming down her face. Nzube, my dear, what has happened to you? She cried, holding her granddaughter's hand tightly. Nzube, still in pain, tried to smile through her tears. Grandma, I am sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I am so sorry. The doctors then informed her of the severity of Nzube's injury. She needed an eye transplant to restore her vision, or else she would be blind forever. The news hit the grandma hard, but without hesitation, she made a decision that would change both their lives forever. Take my eye, the grandmother said to the doctor. Nzube is my life. I have lived long enough. Give her my eye. The day of the surgery arrived faster than anyone expected. Nzube sat anxiously in the hospital bed, her heart heavy with guilt and fear. They told her grandmother the one person who had sacrificed so much for her was about to give up her eyesight, weighed on her. Tears welled in Nzube's eyes as she struggled to accept what was happening. How could her grandmother, already so old and frail, live without her sight? It seemed like too much to ask, but her grandmother insisted that there was no other way. Days after the surgery, Nzube woke in the hospital, her body sore and her head troubling. At first, she was disoriented, unsure of where she was and what had happened. But then the memories of the accident and the surgery came flooding back. Her heart sank as she remembered what her grandmother had done for her. Her grandmother, who had been waiting in the next room, was brought to see Nzube, or rather to be with her. Seeing she could no longer see, the moment her hands touched Nzube burst into tears. Grandma, why did you do this for me? She cried. You've given up so much, and now you've given me your eyes. How can I ever repay you? As Nzube adjusted to her new life, she also had to come to terms with the fact that her grandmother would now depend on her for everything. The woman who had once worked tirelessly to provide for Nzube, who had carried heavy water pots from the river and scrubbed clothes in the cold water, was now blind and unable to do anything on her own. Nzube's grandmother had always been strong, but now she needed Nzube's strength. Elizabeth didn't know how she would manage it all. She was still a student, and though her sight had been restored, her future was uncertain. How could she balance her studies with the responsibility of caring for her blind grandmother? The thought overwhelmed her, but she knew she wouldn't fail. Her grandmother had given everything for her, now it was her turn to give back. Her grandmother, though blind, sensed the strain on Nzube. She would hear the tiredness in Nzube's voice when she came home from class. The signs as she prepared food and with weariness in her footsteps. Nzube, she would say gently, you don't have to do everything. I don't want to be a burden to you. Maybe I should go back to the village. Dear, I can manage on my own. You need to focus on your studies. Nzube shook her head, tears filling her eyes. Grandma, I can't send you back to the village. You are blind. How can you survive there alone? You've done so much for me, I can't abandon you now. I'll find a way to manage both. But no matter how hard Nzube tried, the weight of responsibility was becoming unbearable. Her grades continued to drop and she started skipping classes to stay home with her grandmother. She stopped going out with friends, and the once vibrant and determined girl she had been was slowly fading. The life she had dreamt of, the future her grandmother had sacrificed so much for, seemed to be slipping through her fingers. Life became increasingly difficult for Nzube as the months went by. The weight of caring for her blind grandmother while working long hours as a cleaner was more than she had ever imagined. Nzube had given up her studies, her dreams, and most of her youth to support her grandmother, but it still never felt enough. The money she earned barely covered their feeding and rent, and her grandmother's health was getting worse. The stress was overwhelming, and Nzube felt trapped in a life she hadn't planned. A few days later, when her grandmother was well enough to sit up for a short time, Nzube made a difficult decision. They could no longer survive in the city. She had hoped that life in the city would bring better opportunities, but now it seemed like nothing but struggle. The cost of living was too high and her job was paying too little. With a heavy heart, Nzube told her grandmother that they would return back to the village. "We can't stay here anymore, Grandma," Nzube said gently, trying to hold back her tears. "I'll take you back to the village. It will be easier there. Maybe I can find some work that isn't so exhausting. This city isn't what I thought it would be." One day, while walking through the village back to buy a few things for dinner, Nzube noticed a man staring at her. He was tall, well-dressed, and had an air of wealth about him. His clothes were made of fine fabrics, unlike anything the other villagers wore, and he carried himself with confidence. Nzube felt his eyes on her as she moved through the market, but she tried to ignore him, focusing on her shopping instead. As she was about to leave the market, the man approached her. "Hello, young lady," he said with a smile. "I've been watching you, and I must say, you're quite lovely. What's your name?" Nzube, feeling uneasy, hesitated for a moment before answering. "My name is Nzube," she said quietly, but wanting to withdraw too much attention to her. The man smiled again, his eye gleaming. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Nzube. My name is Emeka. I don't live in the village, but I come here often for business. I couldn't help but notice you. You seem different from the other villagers. I would like to get to know you better, Nzube." Emeka said smoothly. "Perhaps we could meet sometime. I'm looking for a wife, and I think you will be a good match." Nzube was taken aback. A wife? The idea of marriage had never crossed her mind, especially now, with everything she was dealing with. But as she looked at Emeka, she noticed the expensive clothes he wore, the gold wristwatch on his wrist, and the confident way he spoke. He was clearly wealthy, and for a brief moment, Nzube allowed herself to think about what life might be like if she married a man like him. Finally, after days of thinking, Nzube made her decision. She would accept Emeka's proposal. She didn't have any other option. Life in the village wasn't going to get better, and she couldn't keep working herself into the ground, trying to care for her grandmother. This was her chance, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. The wedding was a small, quiet affair. Emeka didn't seem interested in making a big show of it, but Nzube didn't care. All she cared about was the future, the life she hoped to build for herself and her grandma. After the wedding, Emeka took Nzube and her grandmother to his home in the city. It was a large, beautiful house filled with expensive furniture and decorations. Nzube could hardly believe it. After years of living in poverty, she was finally in a place of comfort. However, despite the wealth and luxury surrounding her, Nzube began to feel uneasy. Her grandmother's presence in the house reminded her of the sacrifices that had been made, and even though a nurse was there to help, her grandmother often called on Nzube for assistance. The old woman, blind and frail, still needed her granddaughter's comfort and attention. Sometimes she would call her for Nzube, asking her to come sit with her or help her with small things. Asking her to come sit with her and help her with small things like guiding her to the bathroom or bringing her food. The frustration only grew worse as time passed. Every time Nzube tried to relax or enjoy her new life, her grandmother's needs seemed to interrupt. If her grandmother needed to go to the bathroom and wanted something to eat, she would call for Nzube instead of the nurse. Her grandmother always trusted and relied on Nzube, and she didn't want anyone else to care for her in the same way. Nzube, feeling overwhelmed, started to grow irritated by the constant demands. One afternoon, Nzube was preparing to leave the house with Emeka for a gathering with his friends when her grandmother called for her from the bedroom. Nzube, can you help me get to the bathroom? Her grandmother's shrill voice called out. Nzube froze, frustration bubbling up inside her. She looked at Emeka, who was already dressed and waiting by the door, his expression impatient. For the first time, Nzube felt a surge of anger. Why did her grandmother always call for her at the worst moment? Couldn't the nurse help her? Why was she always the one who had to take care of everything? Nzube, are you coming? Emeka asked, his tone laced with annoyance. I am coming, Nzube muttered, but her feet didn't move. Her grandmother called again, in her weak voice. Nzu, please, I need your help. Nzube clenched her face. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to be the caregiver anymore. She wanted to enjoy her life, to go out with Emeka, to live the life of luxury she had been promised. But her grandmother's needs were always there, always pulling her back into the same responsibilities she had tried to escape. In that moment, Nzube made a decision that would change everything. She turned to Emeka and said, I'm tired of this. I can't do it anymore. Emeka raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? I mean, I can't keep taking care of my grandmother like this. She's always needing something, always calling for me. I thought things would be different now, but nothing has changed. I want to enjoy my life, Emeka. I can't be her servant anymore. Emeka's face softened. He reached out and gently touched her arm. You are right, Nzube. You're too young to be tied down like this. You've done enough. Let the nurse handle it. A few days later, Nzube made another difficult decision. She told Emeka that she wanted to take her grandmother back to the village. She'll be more comfortable, the Nzube said. Emeka didn't argue. He seemed relieved by the decision and he even offered to help with the arrangements. Nzube's grandmother, however, was confused and hurt when Nzube told her the plans. Why are we going back to the village, Nzube? Her grandmother asked, her voice trembling. I thought we were staying here in the city. Isn't this our home now? Nzube swallowed a lump in her throat. It's just for a little while, Grandma, she lied. I think you'll be happier in the village. It's peaceful there and I'll come visit you all the time. But she never came back as she had promised her grandma. Grandma, left with no choice, had to go out to fetch water in a state of blindness. As she managed to get to the stream, as she was about to draw some water into her pot, she mistakenly fell into the river and got drowned as nobody was close enough to help her. When the news of her demise got to Nzube, she was happy that finally her troubles was over. Little did she know that karma was near. Months after Grandma's death, Emeka's business got burnt by fire and he lost everything. He became poor. Nzube's sight began to deteriorate as a result of the complication from the eye surgery she had years ago. Gradually, she began to lose her sight. The condition was too much for Emeka to bear. Taking care of his wife in his frustrated situation, left with no choice, Nzube was disappointed at her husband's actions and she regretted how she treated her grandmother when she was alive. One day, as Nzube sat in her usual spot near the window, lost in her thoughts, she heard a knock at the door. The sound startled her. It had been days since anyone had visited her. Nzube remained still, unsure if she wanted to answer. But the knock came again, this time louder. Who is it? Nzube called out, her voice shaky. A deep, gentle voice responded from the other side of the door. Is a man of God. May I come in? Nzube hesitated. She wasn't sure she wanted to speak to anyone, let alone a stranger. But something about the voice made her feel a flicker of hope. a small light in the darkness that had become her life. "Come in," she finally said. The door creaked open and Nzube heard the soft footsteps of the man, and as he entered the house, she could feel his presence, though she couldn't see him. He moved quietly, almost reverently, and if he understood the pain that filled the room. The man of God stood silently for a moment, observing Nzube as she sat there, her face turned towards the floor. Then he spoke, his voice calm and soothing. "I have heard of your suffering, child. The villagers told me of your blindness and your struggles. I came to see if there is a way to help you." Elizabeth shook her head, her voice filled with bitterness. "There is no helping me. My life is over. I am blind. I will never see again. And even if I could, I don't deserve it. I've made too many mistakes. I abandoned my grandmother and she died because of me." The man of God sat down across from Nzube, his voice filled with understanding. "We all make mistakes, child, but the most important thing is that we seek forgiveness, not just from those we've wronged, but from ourselves." The man of God nodded slowly. "Yes, the blindness of your eyes may be permanent, but there is another kind of blindness that can be healed, the blindness of the soul. You carry a heavy burden of guilt for what happened to your grandmother, but it is not too late to seek for her forgiveness." When they reached the cemetery, Nzube felt the familiar crunch of gravel under her feet and the soft rustle of the trees around them. The man of God guided her to the spot where her grandmother was buried, and then stepped back, giving her the space she needed. Nzube knelt down on the ground, her hands trembling as they touched the cool earth. She could feel the weight of her emotions pressing down on her, the guilt, the sorrow, and the love she still carried for her grandmother. As they sat together by the grave, Nzube felt a sense of peace settling over her. The journey had been long and painful, filled with mistakes, guilt, and sorrow. Then she started crying and asking her grandmother for forgiveness. But she had finally found the forgiveness she has been seeking. Her grandmother's love had never withered, even in death. And now, that love had healed her in ways she could never thought possible. Immediately she finished crying and asking for forgiveness, something different was felt in her. Her eyes that she could barely see with began to see objects moving, and that was how she regained her sight. I've come to the end of this story. I hope you did enjoy it. If this is your first time, you're highly welcome. For my returning subscribers, a big thank you.